Hey, what's up guys, it's Bakes here and thank you for joining me for this episode of Ranked. Today's episode I'll be ranking my favourite albums from the year 2020. I've really enjoyed doing these throwback years, and I use the term throwback pretty loosely. It more so just refers to years before I was on YouTube, because I've ranked my favourite albums from the year 2022 and 2023. They were both years that I was already on YouTube, so when I say throwbacks, I've done 2021 and now today's episode is 2020. And as this series keeps going, I'll be going back further and further through the years. So that's more so what I mean by throwbacks. But I've been really enjoying this series, guys, and going back and checking out music from the past, even though at the moment it's not too far in the past. But as usual, for those who have seen this series before on my channel, I'm sure you guys kind of know the gist of it by now. But before I get into my actual ranking and going through these albums, I'll just do a quick overview of my thoughts of the albums and music that we got in 2020. This was a weird one as I was putting my list together, because when I was comparing the quality of albums that we got in 2020 to some of the years around that time, it wasn't anything overly special. I feel like we didn't get too many real great standout albums in 2020. But this is gonna sound weird. I also feel like it was a low-key underrated year. Because there was a lot of albums that I really do enjoy but kind of overlooked myself, or I feel like are just kind of underrated in general. So this was an interesting one. I did have a good time going back and checking out these albums again. Some of them are just in my frequent rotations anyway, but some of them it had been a little while, so this was a good year to go back and check out again. There are 12 albums in today's ranking, so without delaying it any longer, we'll start off with my number 12 for my favourite albums for the year 2020. So starting off this list for today's video at my number 12, I have the album Glue by Boston Manor. Now this is actually a really weird one to start today's list, because I actually feel like this album is pretty good quality wise. I'd go so far to say that I actually feel like this is a better quality album than my next pick coming up at my number 11. But for a couple of reasons, I do have this album in my last place spot today. Firstly, I don't actually listen to this album that often, if I'm being honest. In fact, I've only kind of recently, and when I say recently, maybe the past year or so, grown to like this album enough to even want to pick it up in the first place. But secondly, and probably most of all, majority of the songs on this album are just kind of passable, maybe fine at best. Yes, there are a couple of songs that really stand out and shine. If I'm picking examples, I'll say Rat King and Liquid. But the rest of it, like I was saying, isn't bad, but it's just kind of passable. The other songs on this album, nothing about them really stands out to me. They're good, but, nothing really special. This album is full of energy and elements that I really do like, but it just doesn't have me reeling back in for much replayability. For me, I'd much rather listen to a Boston Manor album like Datura, where yes, it's a lot shorter. I think Datura is an album of only like 8 songs, but I feel like the songs that they offer there keep me coming back more, because they have more replayability and just more of a drawing factor. So like I said, a weird one to start off today's video, because I actually feel like this album is pretty good quality wise, but for me personally, there's just not a lot of replay value. So coming in at my number 12 is Boston Manor's album Glue. Coming in at my number 11, I have the album Tickets to My Downfall by Machine Gun Kelly. Now, I have a little bit of explaining to do, since I said for my last pick, Glue, that I thought that album was actually better quality than this one here now. And that is a comment that I do 100% stand by and still believe is true. But is this album terrible though? I'm going to say no, even though it's a lot more disappointing than I remember it being. So let's get into that. First of all, this was the first album after Machine Gun Kelly sort of went into his genre switch. He went from doing rap and whatever else he was doing in the past to pop punk. And I was never in the camp of fans that were saying that he reinvented pop punk as a genre. That was far from true, completely false. I'm actually a little bit concerned that there was people that genuinely thought that. The only thing that I'll throw my hat into his corner for was that he sort of gave a pulse to pop punk in the mainstream again, to some extent. But yeah, I definitely wasn't in the camp of people saying that he reinvented pop punk as a genre. I think that's really fucking ridiculous, honestly. But getting back onto topic, I remember when this album came out, I remembered it being fairly solid. Like, it was definitely above average, looking back at my first initial thoughts. However, it had been a really long time since I last checked out this album in full. So upon re-listening to this album for this video, it turns out my new opinion is that it is very alright. It's very mediocre, very in the middle. Before I go any further, I'll also say that I feel like Machine Gun Kelly is one of those artists that gets too much hate, especially after his switch in genres. But this album's quality is actually a lot closer to his follow-up album being Mainstream Sellout, which was an album, first of all, that was like universally hated. I don't think it was as bad as what a lot of people made it out to be, but it definitely wasn't good. So I'm not sure if that is a compliment to Mainstream Sellout or a jab at Tickets to My Downfall, me saying that they're actually a lot closer in quality than I remember them being. But there are a handful of actually decent songs on this album. However, there's also a lot of filler and a lot of songs that just aren't great, if I'm being completely honest. So I'll try and keep this one from going any further. My number 11 is Tickets to My Downfall by Machine Gun Kelly. Now, coming in at my number 10 is the sophomore album by Youngblood titled Weird. Now, this was possibly the album that surprised me the most out of all the ones that I have in today's video, because I was really expecting this one to come in last on my list, but after checking it out again, it turns out this album actually wasn't that bad. Now, with that being said, it still isn't great. Me personally, I've kind of found a drift from Youngblood in general. Even some of his older stuff that I have in my collection that I did enjoy once upon a time, just kind of doesn't hit the same as it once did. But with that being said, I really remembered this album being sort of the definition of okay, and even now it isn't far off of that, but it's a lot better than I remembered it being, so I'll give it its points for that. There are still moments on this album, some songs that are teetering on terrible, if I'm being completely honest. There are some moments that are just kind of cringe, but to be fair, there were a lot of songs as well that I came back to and I was like, fuck, this actually kind of low-key slaps, or even some times where I'm like, okay, the song maybe isn't the greatest, but at least it's kind of fun, at least it has a pulse and it's doing something a little bit different. Again, so not one that I have or will in the future be revisiting a lot, but for one that I didn't have too high of hopes for, it wasn't too bad. You know, as I said, it was kind of the big surprise for the albums in today's list. So my number 10 goes to Weird by Youngblood. For my number 9, I have the album Pink Elephant by the band Stand Atlantic. Now, I've always been pretty straightforward in saying that in my opinion, this is the weakest of the 3 albums that the band has done to date. And honestly, this used to be an album that I didn't really care for. I was actually quite happy to skip over it and never get my hands on a copy and, add it to the collection. But the more that I saw the band live over time and the more I listened to their other 2 albums, this one just slowly grew on me. And this was the album where the band kind of changed up their sound a little bit as well. They kind of went from being straightforward pop punk into having a bit more electronic vibes through their music. And though I feel like they got better with the electronic vibes on the follow-up album being Fear, I feel like this one was still a little bit shaky with its execution. Now, with the track list, I feel like the songs that are offered here are solid enough, but like a few of the albums that I previously mentioned in today's video, honestly, not a lot of them blow me away. Like, if I have to pick a favorite, I'll go with Jurassic Park. Like, that's probably the one exception when it comes to the songs that I like really enjoy. But sort of getting back into what I was saying before, if it wasn't for the other two albums that the band has to offer in their discography and the amount of times that I've seen them live, and I love seeing Stand Atlantic live. I think I've seen them do a live set maybe 3 or 4 times, and each time it's really fucking entertaining, really good, lots of energy. But for those two reasons are probably, the reason why I have this one on somewhat regular rotation. To be fair, it's probably when I'm just listening to the band in general, and, this album makes it into the shuffle. But not nearly close to the best that the band has to offer, but as I said, it has a little bit of replay value. I do have a soft spot somewhat for this album, so my number 9 goes to Pink Elephant by Stand Atlantic. The album Post-Human Survival Horror by the band Bring Me the Horizon comes in at my number 8. Now, this one is a little bit of a bummer because I actually really enjoy this project, but it's also kind of new to me to some extent. After their previous album to this one being Ammo came out, I kind of presumed that the best of the band was behind them. Though I think Ammo is okay, like it's passable, I have it in my collection, I was a little bit underwhelmed with that album, and when this album was leading up to its release and we were hearing little bits of samples, it sounded like it was going to be kind of the same thing, and I kind of put this album on the back burner. It wasn't until a little bit later and I was hearing some people say that, yeah, this album is actually pretty solid, and I was hearing a little bit more of the songs. I was like, okay, this is an album maybe I should give a second chance to. And it honestly wasn't until maybe like a little over a year ago where I really dug my teeth into this album and found out, yeah, this album is actually really cool, and I've completely changed my mind because this album is actually a lot of fun. And that's the main thing too. This album is fun, lots of personality for each of the tracks, a really overall badass feel. So in a way, this effort could have been a little bit higher on this list, but there is a lot of recency bias. To be completely honest, I've only actually recently added this one to my collection and been recently listening to it a lot more. I'm really excited for Post-Human Next Gen, which I actually don't know when it's coming out. It's supposed to come out this year, but they just keep delaying the album, but I'm really looking forward to it. But for now, my number 8 goes to Post-Human Survival Horror by Bring Me the Horizon. Coming in at my number 7 is the album Everyone Loves You Once You Leave Them by the Amity Affliction. This one really bums me out that it's not higher on my list because I really like this album. However, the ones coming up further on this list I just like a little bit more. I've always said that this, in my opinion, is the strongest of the band's most recent efforts by far. This album reminds me very much of the band in their prime, like the stretch of albums from Chasing Ghosts to This Could Be Heartbreak, even though it probably would be the weakest, if I had to put it in there with that stretch of albums, but I still got to give it a point that it's up there with some really quality picks. Honestly, this album is quite consistent, even delivering a few songs that I could put up there with some of the band's best of all time, and I'm not even joking when I say that. All I need to say is Soak Me in Bleach, what a fucking cool song. But even though the rest is consistent, at times there are a few songs that I feel like could hit a little bit harder. A couple of songs that maybe, again in my opinion, don't feel like they could have too longevity, just over time they're starting to fade away a little bit. But overall, a really good return to form in a stretch of albums that were a little bit less consistent, and also just a really underrated album as well. So I'll leave this one here. Coming in at my number 7 is Everyone Loves You Once You Leave Them by the Amity Affliction. Coming in at my number 6 is the album Ugly is Beautiful by Oliver Tree. Now, I kind of forgot how truly great this album is, and I genuinely mean great because this album is awesome. It's an album that I've always liked, and I've always remembered it as being really solid. It has been a little while since I last checked it out in full before re-listening to the album for today's video, but after checking it out again, wow, this album is fucking awesome, like I said. I think kind of because I've been recently re-listening to his latest album that only came out last year. There were a few highs on that album, but a lot of it wasn't the greatest, but I just sort of accepted it was fine because it's Oliver Tree and, you know, he doesn't make serious music all the time, so I just sort of accepted it. But I shouldn't let that slide because when he's making his music at his best, we get something like this and it's so fucking good. For the longest time, I said that his album Cowboy Tears was my favourite album of his, and though I still really enjoy that album, it has dropped for me a little bit over time. Though I really appreciate the change to doing an album that is got this country fusion in it, and again, I still really like that album. I feel like the gimmick just sort of grew thin a little bit over time. But this album here, Ugly is Beautiful, is banger after banger. Each song has something that I really enjoy about it. And I need him to return to this form because at this form, it is fucking like perfect. And I also need him to give us a physical CD release of this album because I think he's only done vinyl so far. I need a CD. My number 6 goes to Ugly is Beautiful by Oliver Tree. The album Hello It's You by the band Bearings comes in at my number 5. I've kind of decided that Bearings is one of the best modern pop punk bands that keep it simple, yet still manage to make their music work and, you know, keep it fresh and just do a really good job overall. They don't often drift into heavier territory besides the occasional change up every now and then. They don't make it unnecessary or flashy or anything. They just make really catchy and easy to listen to pop punk songs, and you gotta commend them for that. This album is not an exception to that. However, to be honest, this was an album of theirs that took a little while to grow on me, if I'm being completely honest. Their debut album before this one, Blue in the Dark, had me hooked upon first listen. That album is just so consistent with its tracks. However, this one started out a little bit more hit and miss for me, but over time, grown to really love this album. Now, with that being said, not every track lands on this album, but the ones that do fucking slap, like so many fucking underrated bangers on this album. The ones that miss still aren't offensively bad, which is good. Just really simple, easy to listen to album, like I said before. Just being an album that is super awesome by an underrated band as well. I feel like not many people check out Bearings and they need to, especially, like I said, if you like pop punk music. So my number 5 goes to the album Hello It's You by the band Bearings. Coming in at my number 4 is the album Race Car Blues by the band Slowly Slowly. This is an underrated album for myself from the band's discography. Not saying that in my opinion it's their best or anything like that, but still really solid. You know, to be completely honest, it's not like every song here is a banger. There's actually a couple of songs here that I don't really care for at all. But it's another scenario of the ones that hit fucking hard and they're so fucking good. Slowly Slowly in general, just as a band, has been one that's grown on me massively over time. Like, just off the top of my head, I'm trying to think, but off the top of my head, I gotta say they're the band that I've seen the most times live. I think I've seen them like 4 or 5 times now. And this album houses so many of their greatest hits, as well as some underrated gems. Like, I gotta give an underrated gem shout out for a second. Songs like Safety Switch and Soil, so fucking good. But like I said, pretty underrated for me personally, even though I know for a fact this is a lot of people's favourite Slowly Slowly album. It's normally either this one or St. Leonard's, but for me personally it's neither. I gotta pick Daisy Chain as my favourite album, but either way, this is still an album to not undermine. It's so fucking awesome. It knows when to hit hard, and it also knows when to take a breath and slow it down. There's a few stripped back songs here. And just overall, like, really great writing, great instrumentals by a super underrated Australian band. Hopefully I'm putting it on a few people's radar. They're getting really popular here in Australia, but I still feel like when I'm watching other people's YouTube videos and people trying to get into sort of more alternative music, this is a band to check out. So my number 4 goes to Race Car Blues by the band Slowly Slowly. Coming in at my number 3 spot is the album Calm by 5 Seconds of Summer. Now, to be completely honest, I've always had a soft spot for 5 Seconds of Summer. Growing up as a teenager, they were a pop punk band that managed, in a way, to scratch my itch for pop punk influence in the mainstream, especially mainstream radio. And I can't deny that I've followed the band's discography over the years, from the point that they've evolved from teenage pop influence into more pop rock vibe with their kind of sound. And they kind of changed the formula with the previous album to this one being Youngblood. And at the end of the day, I do feel like that was the right choice for the long run. And Youngblood is still an album that I really do enjoy. However, over time, I feel like maybe it's lost a little bit of its shine. But I can confidently say that this album, Calm, is, in my opinion, their best album and at least my favourite. And like I said, they've sort of gone a little bit more into experimental pop rock elements that they've been putting forward lately, and a growth as individuals with their instruments, and then also as a collective with their songwriting, you know, a lot more mature with their meaningful and thoughtful lyrics that they're putting forward. To me, this album just really works. I know overall 5 Seconds of Summer are a band that's not everyone's cup of tea. They can be really hit and miss with people. But as I said, I've always loved this band, always had a soft spot for them. So this ranking is a little bit biased with this one, but I do really like this album. At the end of the day, it's my list also, so I can do whatever I want. So my number 3 is the album Calm by 5 Seconds of Summer. Coming in at my number 2, I have the album Old Distortions Are Intentional by the band Neck Deep. Now, Neck Deep are one of my all-time favourite bands, so influential to why I love the pop punk genre, or they, as they would put it in their own words, generic pop punk. But with all that being said, I would say that, in my opinion, this is their weakest album to date. It sort of changed their sound to a little bit more polished pop sounding, which overall not a fail, but just not really my thing. Writing at moments here are like a little bit cringe and at times whiny, but it sort of speaks volumes for how much I still love this album, you know, it being my least favourite in their discography, but still my second favourite for the year. It's still got your more typical sounding pop punk stuff with songs like Sonderland or Fall. It has some experimental stuff like a song like Low Life, which I still think is pretty cool. Yes, there are songs that I don't care for much at all, ones like Quarry or Little Dove, but then it's also got a lot of songs that have grown on me over time, like Telling Stories and What Took You So Long. So overall, it's actually a quite unique gathering of songs and trying new things, you know, throughout this album. But as I said, for an all-time favourite band, this being, as I said, in my opinion, the weakest in their discography. And this isn't me saying that this is a bad album at all. I still have a lot of fun, you know, revisiting this album, and that's a main point as well. This album is definitely got a lot of replay value. So coming in at my number 2 is the album Old Distortions Are Intentional by the band Neck Deep. And here we are, my number 1 favourite album of the year 2020. Here I have No Good Left to Give by the band Movements. This is an album that I've constantly praised and always had a love for. Movements are a band with 3 albums to date, and none of them are misses. They're all fucking really good. And they started with a really strong debut album being Feel Something. Their latest album, Ruckus, has had really good feedback, and I've also really enjoyed that album. So in ways, this album is the unsung, underrated gem of the 3. And like I said, it's always been my favourite. As I said, 3 albums to date now that are all hits, so it's getting really tight. But if I had to pick a favourite, I got to go with this one. This album to me has the best consistency. There are no bad songs on this album. Flows together extremely well, and it's like effortless to listen to this album. You just put it on, listen to it from start to finish, and then just go through it again. It's such a good fucking listen. Like I said, when the consistency is this fucking good, it's hard to like not have this album as a favorite of the year. Only one minor criticism is that the highest highs from the other two albums surpassed the highest highs on this album. Just the biggest hits on those other two surpass the biggest hits here is probably the best way of explaining it. But like I said, the consistency and the overall how good this album is, it's really hard to fault. Great writing, great instrumentals, just overall great album. So again, my number one favourite album of the year 2020, here I have No Good Left to Give by the band Movements. So there we go, guys. Thank you for joining me for today's video, ranking my favourite albums from the year 2020. Now, as usual, before I get into my proper outro, I'll do a quick little recap of my list. So coming in at number 12 was Glue by Boston Manor. My number 11 was Tickets to My Downfall by Machine Gun Kelly. Just don't have a copy of that album. My number 10 goes to Weird by Youngblood. My number 9 was Pink Elephant by Stand Atlantic. My number 8 was Post-Human Survival Horror by Bring Me the Horizon. My number 7 was Everyone Loves You Once You Leave Them, The Amity Affliction. My number 6 I also didn't have a copy of. Please release a CD, Oliver, you fucking release it please. Is Ugly is Beautiful by Oliver Tree. Number 5 goes to Hello It's You by Bearings. My number 4 was Race Car Blues by Slowly Slowly. Into my top 3, my third place was Calm by 5 Seconds of Summer. Second place went to All Distortions Are Intentional, Neck Deep. And my number 1, my favourite album of 2020 was No Good Left to Give. So there we go, guys, through my recap. And again, thank you for joining me for this video, guys. I know sometimes these ranking videos go on for a little while, but hopefully you guys are enjoying it, just enjoying the music content as in general. I know this is a lot more of a horror channel, but I like to share my love of music as well, and hopefully you guys tune in and let me know, guys, like what your thoughts on the albums that we got in 2020. Any of the ones in this list today that you want to share your opinions on, go for it. Or if there's any that you feel like I've missed and you feel like I would enjoy, hit me up about them as well. But thank you again for joining me in this video, guys, and I'll see you for another one soon. Peace.